On a freezing night in New York City, when the snow fell like ashes from a cold, gray sky, something remarkable happened, a moment so small, so ordinary, that no one on the street would have noticed. But it would change two lives forever. It happened at a lonely bus stop on the corner of 56th and Madison, under the faint, flickering glow of a street lamp. The city, usually roaring with life, was quiet that night, muffled by the falling snow and the bitter wind that cut through every layer of clothing. And there, standing alone, was a man named James. His jacket was thin, old, the olive green color faded after years of wear. He clutched a worn folder to his chest, filled with resumes, each one a silent reminder of doors closed in his face. James wasn't just cold, he was tired. Tired in the way only a man who's lost everything can be. He had once been a structural engineer, a man who built schools, hospitals, homes. But life, as it often does, had stripped everything away, his job, his home, even his family. Tonight, he stood at that bus stop with nothing left but an old truck to sleep in and the memory of a son he'd promised to come back for. But that's not where the story ends. Because in the middle of that winter silence, another figure appeared, a woman, shivering, breathless, dressed in business clothes entirely unsuited for the storm. She was cold, fragile against the night, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if she could hold in her own warmth. And without hesitation, without knowing who she was or why she stood there, James did something no one else would have. He took off the only jacket he had, the last thing that shielded him from the cold, and draped it over her shoulders. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. He didn't know that this woman wasn't just anyone, that she was one of the most powerful CEOs in the city. He couldn't have known that in that moment, as he stood there shivering, he was planting the seed of a second chance not only for himself but for her, too. Because this isn't just a story about a jacket. It's a story about how one act of kindness, offered without expectation, can ripple outward like a stone dropped in still water. It's about how, sometimes, when we have nothing left to give, that's when we give the very thing that matters most. And what started as a simple gesture, a man offering his jacket to a stranger, would lead to so much more. A job. A new home. A family reunited. And even, when neither of them expected it, love. So stay with me. Because what you're about to hear is not just a story. It's a reminder that the smallest moments, the quietest choices, can rewrite a life, and sometimes, they rewrite two. It was the kind of winter night that felt like it could cut through bone. The streets of New York, usually alive with movement and noise, had quieted under the heavy weight of falling snow. Streetlights glowed faintly behind a curtain of white, and the city that never slept seemed, for once, to be holding its breath. At a nearly empty bus stop on Madison Avenue, under the flickering light of a tired old lamp, a man stood alone. His name was James Miles. 46 years old, once a respected structural engineer, now little more than a shadow against the cold. His jacket, an old, olive green thing, fraying at the sleeves, hung loose on his thin frame. He clutched a weathered manila folder close to his chest like it was something precious. Inside were 5 resumes, each one printed carefully, hopefully, and each one returned without a call, without a chance. His breath came out in clouds, his fingers numb beneath thin gloves as he stood waiting for a bus that seemed like it might never come. For James, this wasn't just another cold night. It was the latest in a long line of nights spent fighting to stay afloat, holding onto hope by a thread. He hadn't always been like this. There was a time when he built things, schools, hospitals, homes. He knew how to measure steel and concrete, how to make something solid out of nothing. But life doesn't measure loss in steel and concrete. Years ago, cancer had taken his wife, Lily. It had crept in quietly, and by the time they caught it, there was nothing the doctors could do. 9 months after her diagnosis, she was gone, and with her, the life James had spent years building unraveled like a thread pulled loose. Bills piled up faster than he could pay them. The house was sold. The savings drained away. He worked odd jobs to keep the lights on, to keep food in the fridge, to keep going for his son, Noah. But grief is a heavy thing. And when the eviction notices came and the money ran out, social services stepped in. They told him Noah needed stability, that he needed more than what James could give. And James, with nothing left to fight them, had to let his son go. Now, he lived out of an old rusted truck behind a warehouse on the edge of the city. Every day, he sent resumes. Every day, he showed up at job fairs with shoes that had holes in them and a folder full of rejection. Every night, he folded himself into the cold silence of his truck and told himself tomorrow would be different. Tonight felt no different. Until she appeared. Through the veil of falling snow, he saw her, a woman hurrying down the sidewalk, her heels clicking against the wet pavement. She looked like she belonged in a boardroom somewhere, not out in the storm. She wore a skirt, a blouse, her hair plastered to her face by the damp wind. No coat. Her arms were crossed tightly against her chest, trying to hold in what little warmth she had left. She stopped under the same awning, breathless, shivering. James glanced at her out of the corner of his eye, trying not to stare. There was something about her, the way she held herself, polished but fragile, strong but cracking at the edges. For a few minutes, they stood there in silence, two strangers in the cold. James told himself not to care. She wasn't his problem. He had enough of his own. But then the wind howled sharp against them, and he saw her flinch, curling in on herself like she was trying to disappear. And something inside him, something that hadn't fully died, despite everything, moved. Without a word, James shrugged off his jacket. It wasn't much. It barely kept the cold out for him. But it was all he had left. He stepped toward her and held it out. She looked at him, startled, as if she couldn't believe what he was offering. "You don't have to do that," she said, her voice thin against the wind. James gave her a tired smile, one that barely reached his eyes. "I've already lost enough today," he told her. "This coat, it's the only thing I have left to give." She hesitated, eyes flickering over him, the thin gloves, the folder clutched in his hands, the worn-out shoes. He was clearly worse off than she was. But when he gently draped the jacket over her shoulders, she didn't stop him. The fabric smelled faintly of soap and coffee and something else she couldn't quite name. It was old, threadbare, but it was warm. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice catching. James just nodded and folded his arms tightly against his chest to keep in what little warmth he had left. The snow kept falling. The world felt quieter. A moment later, she glanced at him again, studying him like she was seeing something she couldn't quite figure out. "What's your name?" she asked. "James," he replied. "I'm Claire." He nodded again. "Nice to meet you, Claire." She looked like she wanted to say something more but didn't. When the bus finally arrived, headlights cutting through the snow, she moved toward it, but before she stepped inside, she reached into her purse and pulled out a small business card. "In case you ever need anything," she said, holding it out. James took it quietly, slipping it into his folder without looking at it. He'd heard that before, polite words, promises no one meant. Claire boarded the bus, glancing back at him one last time, the coat wrapped tightly around her like armor. James stood there, alone again, watching as the bus disappeared into the storm. He didn't know her name would mean anything tomorrow. He didn't know that simple gesture would be the thing that cracked open the heavy, frozen doors of his life. All he knew that night was that he had nothing left to give, and yet, somehow, he still gave. That night, after the bus disappeared into the falling snow and the city swallowed up the sound of its engine, James didn't wait long at the bus stop. He turned and walked away, his shoulders hunched against the cold, the thin fabric of his shirt doing little to keep out the wind now that he'd given away his only jacket. The streets were nearly empty. The kind of quiet that felt heavy, like the city itself was holding its breath. His footsteps crunched over slushy pavement as he made his way down dark back streets, away from the shining lights of Midtown, toward the forgotten corners of the city, the places people like him disappeared into without anyone noticing. James moved slowly. There was no need to hurry. No one was waiting for him. No warm apartment light left on. No one asking when he'd be home. He had nothing waiting but an old truck parked behind a warehouse at the edge of the Bronx, and the silence that had followed him ever since everything he loved slipped through his fingers. It was just after 9 when he finally reached it. The old '98 Chevy looked as tired as he felt, paint chipped, tires half buried in snow, rust blooming across the doors like old scars. It hadn't moved in days. It wouldn't. The heater had given out years ago. He climbed inside without turning on the light. There wasn't much to see anyway. A mess of threadbare blankets piled on the passenger seat. A pillow propped in the corner. A lunchbox tucked under the dashboard holding exactly 2 granola bars and an old, dented thermos. But there was one thing he always kept close. From the glove compartment, James pulled out a small tin box. He opened it carefully, like it might fall apart in his hands. Inside was a faded photograph, worn soft at the edges from too many nights like this one. It was his wife, Lily. Smiling bright, head tilted toward the camera like she was caught mid-laughter. Beside her, a little boy, 7 years old, messy hair, gap-toothed grin. Their son, Noah. James stared at it for a long time, the cold settling into his bones. "Good night, Lily," he whispered, voice barely audible in the dark. "Good night, Noah." He leaned back against the cold window, the memories pressing in around him like the snow outside. He had once had everything. A family. A home. A job that mattered. He used to build things, schools, hospitals, places meant to last long after he was gone. He used to believe that hard work and good intentions were enough to keep the world from falling apart. But then, Lily got sick. The cancer came like a thief in the night, and by the time they caught it, there was no fixing it. 9 months later, she was gone. James had quit everything to care for her, to hold her hand through every appointment, every tear, every impossible decision. And when she slipped away, the bills piled up faster than he could keep up with. The house was the first to go. Then the savings. Then the small apartment. They'd moved from place to place, smaller and smaller each time, until there was nothing left but this truck. Through it all, James had fought to protect Noah. He turned the back seat of that truck into a spaceship, told bedtime stories about astronauts and pirates and brave little boys who could survive anything. He smiled when he didn't feel like smiling. He shaved every morning, no matter how tired he was, because he wanted his son to believe things would get better, even when he wasn't sure himself. But the world has a way of breaking even the strongest of us. A year ago, a social worker had shown up with papers and concerned eyes. They told James he couldn't provide a stable home. That Noah deserved better. James hadn't fought them, not really. He knew they were right. So he signed the papers, watched his son walk away, and promised, just for now, "I'll come back for you." Every day since then had been a climb. He'd stood in job fair lines. He'd handed out resumes. He'd gone to free workshops at the public library, studied late into the night, hoping for one more shot. Hoping he could scrape together enough to get a roof over his head, a bed for his son. But tonight, that hope felt further away than ever. Tonight, he'd come back to the cold, to the truck, to nothing. And yet, he thought of her. Claire. The woman at the bus stop, standing there in that storm like she didn't belong in it. The way she had shivered, the way her eyes had softened when he handed her the jacket. He didn't know why he'd done it. Maybe because she reminded him of Lily, kind, beautiful, fragile in a way she didn't want anyone to see. Or maybe, in that moment, he just wanted to feel like he was still capable of doing something good. Like he was still the kind of man who could give more than he took, even when he had nothing left. James pulled the threadbare blanket over himself and shut his eyes against the cold. Outside, the snow kept falling. The world kept moving past him. But tonight, in the quiet dark, he held onto one small thing, that feeling of handing over his coat, of seeing someone's eyes soften because of something he did. It wasn't much. But it was enough to keep him going, one more night. That night, while James lay shivering beneath a nest of blankets in the cold shell of his old Chevy truck. Miles away, in the glittering heights of Manhattan, Claire Langston stood alone in her apartment, warm, safe, but somehow frozen in her own way. The elevator ride up to her penthouse had felt longer than usual. She'd barely noticed the doorman's polite nod, hadn't paid attention to the soft hum of the heater or the polished marble floors under her heels. All she could think about was the weight on her shoulders, and it wasn't the cold anymore. It was the jacket. His jacket. She hadn't meant to take it. She hadn't wanted to. When he handed it to her, she'd almost protested again. He needed it far more than she did. Anyone with eyes could see that. But there was something in the way he looked at her, tired, kind, like he had nothing left to give and yet still chose to give anyway, that made it impossible to refuse. Now, in the silence of her penthouse, she stood by the window, the city light stretching out beneath her, and ran her fingers over the rough fabric. It smelled faintly of soap and something else, something human, real. It was warm. It was worn. It didn't belong here, in this pristine, polished space filled with leather furniture and glass walls. She was about to set it aside when her fingers brushed against something tucked inside. Curious, she reached into the inner pocket and felt the edge of folded paper. She pulled it out carefully, a single, crumpled piece, soft at the edges, smudged with fingerprints and time. It was a drawing. A child's drawing, done in bright crayon strokes. Two stick figures stood beneath a crooked sun, holding hands. Above one, the word Dad. Above the other, me. And at the bottom, written in uneven handwriting, for words that felt heavier than anything she'd ever read. I love you, Daddy. Noah. Claire stared at the drawing, the colors blurring before her eyes, her throat tightening without warning. Suddenly, everything about that man at the bus stop came crashing into focus. The way he had clutched that folder to his chest like it contained his whole life, the exhaustion in his eyes, the way he had given her his coat without hesitation. This wasn't just a man on the streets. He was a father. A father who had lost everything but still carried a piece of his child close to his heart. A father who had nothing, yet still gave. She sank down onto the edge of her expensive leather couch, the jacket still in her hands, the drawing resting gently in her lap. And for the first time in years, Claire Langston felt something crack open inside her. Because she knew what it meant to shiver alone in the cold. She had spent most of her childhood doing just that, bouncing from foster home to foster home, learning early how to build walls around herself, how to survive without needing anyone. She had clawed her way out of that life, worked 2 jobs through college, turned an idea into a tech empire, and made sure she would never again know what it meant to need. But somewhere along the way, she had forgotten what it meant to give. Her fingers tightened around the jacket as she thought back to a memory she had buried for years, a night much like this one, when she was 12 years old, cold and scared, sitting outside the steps of a church because she had nowhere else to go. A man had stopped. A stranger. Withered, tired. He had taken off his coat and wrapped it around her without saying a word. She never saw him again. Until tonight, she hadn't thought of him in years. And now, here she was, holding another man's jacket, a man who had given without asking, without expecting anything in return. A man who, without knowing it, had reminded her who she used to be. Claire wiped at her eyes quickly, almost angrily, because she wasn't the kind of woman who cried. Not anymore. She'd built an empire from nothing. She was the CEO of Infinity Group, one of the most powerful women in the city. But tonight, none of that mattered. Because there, in her hands, was proof that somewhere out there, in the cold, was a man who had nothing, and gave anyway. And suddenly, she knew. She couldn't just let this moment fade away. She couldn't walk away, shrug it off, pretend it hadn't touched something deep inside her. She had to find him. Not because she owed him, but because she couldn't forget him. Because something told her, maybe he wasn't the only one who needed saving. Claire didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen counter long after midnight, the crumpled drawing still in front of her, the jacket folded neatly beside it like something sacred. She kept tracing her fingers over those crayon lines, the crooked sun, the stick figures, the little heart floating between them, as if she could somehow understand the weight behind them. By morning, she had made up her mind. Most people knew Claire Langston as sharp, driven, relentless. The kind of woman who built an empire from the ground up and never stopped moving. What they didn't know was that when she set her mind on something, whether it was building a company or finding a man who had quietly given her his last bit of warmth, she didn't stop until she got answers. At 9 a.m. sharp, she sat in her glass-walled office overlooking the city skyline. She didn't waste time. She rang the small silver bell on her desk. Moments later, her assistant, Rachel, stepped into the room, tablet in hand, expecting another meeting, another corporate battle plan. But Claire's request wasn't what Rachel expected. "I need you to help me find someone," Claire said, her voice calm but firm. Rachel blinked, confused. "Of course. Who?" Claire hesitated for a heartbeat, almost unsure how to explain. "His name is James. I don't know his last name. He was at the bus stop at 56th and Madison last night around 8:30. He gave me his coat." Rachel's brows knitted together slightly, unsure where this was going, but she nodded without question. "I'll see what I can do." "One more thing," Claire added quietly. "This stays between us." What followed over the next few days wasn't the kind of search Infinity Group was known for. Normally, Claire's team tracked down elusive tech developers, corporate executives hiding behind NDAs, or billionaires trying to stay out of the spotlight. But this time, the mission was different. Her team pulled traffic camera footage from the nearest intersections. In the grainy, snowy images, they spotted a figure standing at the bus stop, a man bundled in an olive jacket, blurry but unmistakably him. They traced the bus routes that stopped at that corner. Cross-referenced entry logs. Checked databases. But James wasn't in any of the systems they usually searched. Finally, after almost a week, Rachel walked back into Claire's office holding a thin folder. "I found him," she said quietly. Claire took the folder without a word. Inside was a copy of an old driver's license. A LinkedIn profile that hadn't been touched in years. A scan of an expired construction license. A short summary of forum posts where James had quietly asked about job openings, posts that had never been answered. There were no criminal records. No scandals. Just silence. Rachel cleared her throat. "His name is James Miles. He used to be a structural engineer. No employment records in the last few years. No permanent address. He's been spotted near the south end of the Bronx. There's an old pickup truck parked behind a warehouse. He's been living in it." Claire stared down at the file, her heart tightening in her chest. She had known he was struggling. She had seen it in his eyes that night. But seeing it on paper, laid out so clinically, so cold, made it real in a way she hadn't prepared for. Rachel spoke again, her voice softer this time. "We can arrange for someone to reach out to him." Discreetly. Claire shook her head. "No," she said quietly. "I'll do it myself." An hour later, Claire sat in the back of a black sedan, far from the shining towers of Midtown, as the car wound its way through the broken streets of the Bronx. She didn't say much on the ride. She just kept looking out the window, her fingers brushing absently against the folded drawing in her pocket. When they finally pulled up near a crumbling warehouse, she spotted it immediately, the old, rusted Chevy tucked beneath a collapsed awning, half buried in snow. It looked like it hadn't moved in weeks. Like the world had forgotten it. She stepped out of the car without waiting, heels crunching softly against the gravel and slush. The cold bit at her skin, but she barely felt it. As she got closer, she could make out the figure in the front seat, a man slumped against the window, fast asleep, wrapped in threadbare blankets. She hesitated for a moment, suddenly unsure what she would even say. Then, as if he sensed her, the door creaked open. James stepped out, blinking against the daylight, his face weary, unshaven. He squinted at her, confusion flashing across his face. And then, recognition. Claire, he said, voice rough with sleep and surprise. She offered a small smile, uncertain but sincere. Hi, James. He looked down at himself, at his wrinkled clothes, at the truck behind him. Embarrassment flickered across his face like a shadow. What are you doing here? He asked, folding his arms instinctively. Claire swallowed, the words catching in her throat. I came to find you, she said simply. He frowned, puzzled and cautious. Why? She glanced down, then met his eyes. Because I couldn't stop thinking about what you did. About the kind of person who gives their only coat to a stranger. For a moment, he just stared at her, the lines on his face deepening. Then he let out a short, bitter laugh, shaking his head. You didn't have to come all this way for that, he muttered. A thank you card would have done the trick. Claire shook her head gently. It's not about saying thank you, she said softly. It's about not letting something good disappear without being seen. For a long moment, they stood there, two people from completely different worlds, brought together by a moment in the snow. And though neither of them knew it yet, this was only the beginning. A few days passed before James saw her again. He had gone back to his routine, back to the slow, grinding rhythm of survival, waking up cold, brushing snow off his windshield, standing in line at job sites hoping someone would need an extra pair of hands. He tried not to think too much about the woman who had shown up at his truck, about the look in her eyes when she said she couldn't stop thinking about what he'd done. But she lingered in the back of his mind anyway, like a quiet echo. Then, one cold morning on the edge of Queens, he saw her again, when he least expected it. James had been working a day shift at a construction site, moving cinder blocks, hauling materials in the biting wind. His breath puffed out in clouds, his hands rough and calloused, his shoulders aching from hours of work. It wasn't much, but it was something. Another day, another $20, another way to stay afloat. When he finally took his break, sitting on a low wall with a cheap plastic water bottle in hand, he looked up and froze. Claire was walking toward him, a coffee cup in her hands. She was out of place here, her tailored coat, her polished shoes, her calm, determined expression. She walked straight toward him, like she had come here for one reason and one reason only. James stood quickly, brushing dust off his pants, awkward and unsure. Claire, he said, surprise and confusion plain in his voice. What are you doing here? She handed him the coffee cup without answering at first. I thought you might like something warm, she said softly. He took it, glancing around nervously, conscious of how he looked, dusty jeans, worn boots, sweat at his collar. You really didn't have to, he muttered. I know, she replied. But I wanted to. They stood there for a beat, the cold wind tugging at their clothes. Then she spoke again. Would you come with me? She asked, her voice almost hesitant. Just for a bit. I'd like to show you something. James glanced down at his work boots, then back toward the foreman at the edge of the site. I've still got a few hours on shift. I already spoke to him, Claire said gently. Told him you had an interview. His brows drew together. I don't have an interview. You do now. Before he could argue, she was already turning back toward the car parked behind the chain-link fence. James let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding, shaking his head in disbelief. But he followed her anyway. The ride into the city was quiet. James sat stiffly in the passenger seat, the coffee cup warm between his hands, stealing occasional glances at Claire when he thought she wasn't looking. He couldn't figure her out. Couldn't understand why she kept showing up in his life, why she hadn't let that night at the bus stop be just another moment that faded away. When the car finally pulled up in front of a towering glass building in downtown Manhattan, James stared out the window, bewildered. Infinity Group. The name gleamed in polished silver letters over the front entrance. He shook his head, almost laughed. I don't belong here, he muttered under his breath. Claire turned to him. Just come upstairs. He followed her through the marble-floored lobby, past security guards and busy professionals who barely glanced at him. It felt like walking into a different universe, one he had long stopped believing he'd ever belong to. They entered a small, quiet conference room on the 5th floor, glass walls overlooking the endless skyline. Claire offered him a chair and sat across from him, her expression serious but warm. James cleared his throat awkwardly, still unsure why he was here. "So what's all this about?" he asked, folding his arms. Claire smiled slightly. "Returning the coat?" He shook his head. "If that's why I'm here, I'm gonna need it back. That was a good jacket." She laughed, the sound soft and genuine. "No," she said. "This isn't about the coat. I kept that. It's mine now." James blinked at her, confused. Claire leaned forward, her eyes meeting his. "I didn't come to thank you, James. I came because you made me remember something I'd forgotten. A version of myself I buried under years of meetings and deadlines." She reached into her bag and slid a folder across the table. Inside was a job proposal. James opened it slowly, his brow furrowing as he read. It wasn't a construction job. It wasn't charity. It was something else entirely. A new position she had created, cultural and human values advisor. A role with no fancy qualifications attached, no corporate jargon. A job meant to do one thing: remind the people in this company that kindness matters. That humanity matters. That it's possible to be successful without forgetting how to care. James shook his head, a bitter chuckle escaping his lips. "Claire, look at me," he said, gesturing at himself. "I don't have a degree in psychology. I haven't worked in an office in years. I sleep in a truck." "You were an engineer," she replied calmly. "I haven't built anything in a long time. You built a moment I'll never forget." He looked away, overwhelmed, his throat tightening. "This isn't charity, James," she said gently. "This is something only you can do. You know what it's like to feel invisible, to be passed over. And yet you gave your last coat to a stranger. That tells me more about leadership than any resume ever could." He shook his head again, voice low. "I'm not qualified." Claire's voice softened even further. "You don't need a degree to teach people how to care. Because you live it. Every single day." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, he closed the folder and looked out the window, the city sprawling out beneath them. And for the first time in years, something flickered in his chest. It wasn't fear. It wasn't defeat. It was hope. Unfamiliar. Terrifying. But hope, all the same. James left the glass-walled office with the job proposal still unopened in his hands. He walked through the polished marble lobby, past people in suits and heels who didn't look at him twice, and stepped back out into the cold New York air. The folder felt heavier than it should have. He crossed the street without thinking, weaving through the crowd until he reached a quiet park bench tucked away from the noise. He sat down, the proposal resting on his lap, untouched. And then he just stared at it. He didn't need to open it. He already knew what it was, an opportunity too good to be real, a chance that didn't belong to someone like him. His fingers traced the edge of the folder as the same old voice crept back in. The one that had followed him since the day he signed the papers to let Noah go. Since the day he moved into that truck. That voice whispered cruel things. "This isn't real. You'll mess it up. People like her don't help people like you. She's just being nice. You don't belong in her world." For years, James had taught himself not to expect anything from anyone. He knew how it felt when people smiled politely and walked away. He knew how it felt to be overlooked, invisible, forgotten. And now, sitting on that cold bench, part of him wondered if this was the same thing, a kind gesture that would fade into nothing. He sat there for a long time, the busy city moving around him like he wasn't even there. Until a shadow fell across the pavement beside him. He looked up to see Claire standing there, her hands tucked in her coat pockets, her hair pulled back, no makeup, no armor, just her. "You haven't opened it," she said quietly. James gave a dry, humorless chuckle. "Didn't think I needed to. I already know how this ends." Claire tilted her head slightly, watching him. "How does it end?" she asked. He shrugged, not looking at her. "Someone like me doesn't end up in a place like this. You don't build companies like Infinity Group by hiring people who sleep in trucks." For a moment, she didn't answer. Then she sat down beside him, close enough that he could feel her warmth, but not too close. "You think I made you an offer out of pity," she said. He glanced at her sideways, but didn't deny it. Claire took a slow breath, her gaze fixed on the street in front of them. "Come with me," she said after a moment. "Just for an hour." James shook his head, already preparing to argue. "No suits. No meetings," she added quickly. "No corporate nonsense. Just trust me." Against every instinct he had, against the voice that told him to walk away, to not believe in things like this, he stood up. They drove in silence, out of Midtown, past the shiny towers and bright lights, until the streets grew quieter, older, rough around the edges. Finally, Claire asked the driver to pull over in front of a small red brick building with a green awning faded by time. A painted sign hung above the door. "Thomas's Place, a safe space for every child." James looked at her, puzzled. She didn't explain. She led him inside. The smell of crayons and warm bread filled the air. The walls were painted bright, covered in messy handprints and drawings. Children's laughter echoed down the hallway, loud, joyful, real. Claire led him past a reading room where a volunteer sat cross-legged on the floor, reading to a small group of kids. Past a kitchen where someone was baking. Into a wide playroom where children sprawled across the floor building puzzles and coloring with markers. James looked around, taking it all in. "This place," Claire said quietly beside him, "is named after the man who saved me." James turned to her, surprised. She kept her gaze on the children. "I grew up in the foster system. Bounced around a lot. Some homes were kind. Some weren't. One night, when I was 12, I ran away. I was cold, hungry, and scared. I curled up on the steps of a church, waiting for morning." She paused, her voice softening. "An old man named Thomas found me. He didn't ask questions. He didn't try to fix anything. He just sat with me. He gave me his coat." James's throat tightened as he listened. "I never saw him again," Claire said. "But that night, he showed me I mattered." She finally looked at James, her eyes shining but steady. "Last week, someone else gave me a coat. Someone who didn't know me. Didn't ask for anything. Someone who had nothing but still gave." Her voice wavered slightly. "You remind me of him. Not because of what you gave me, but because of who you are." James swallowed hard, the lump in his throat almost too big to speak around. They stood there in silence, surrounded by laughter and life. Claire touched his arm gently. "I don't need you to fit into a boardroom, James. I need you to remind people of this. Of what it means to care." For a long moment, James couldn't speak. The voice in his head, the one that told him he didn't belong, went quiet for the first time in years. And when he finally nodded, it wasn't for the job. It wasn't for the salary or the title. It was because, standing there in that warm, messy, beautiful room, he finally felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt like he mattered. James's first day at Infinity Group didn't look anything like the corporate fairy tales you see in movies. There were no banners, no balloons, no excited chatter in the hallways. No one rolled out a red carpet when he walked through the lobby in his second-hand jacket and scuffed shoes. Instead, it began quietly, with a simple meeting in a small glass-walled room on the 5th floor. Claire introduced him without fanfare. "This is James Miles," she told a handful of department heads seated around the table, some of them frowning, others politely curious. "He's here to help us build something more meaningful than profit." That was it. No flashy titles. No resume readout. James sat at the end of the table, folding his calloused hands together, feeling every skeptical glance in the room. He didn't look like anyone else in that office. He wasn't polished. He wasn't corporate. And he knew, deep down, that half the people in that room were wondering why he was even there. But when he spoke, he didn't try to impress them. He told them the truth. He talked about what it felt like to lose everything. What it was like to sleep in a freezing truck, to show up to job interviews knowing the holes in your shoes would speak louder than your words. He spoke about what it meant to choose kindness anyway, even when the world made you feel invisible. At first, they listened politely, cautiously. But James wasn't there to give a speech. He wasn't there to prove anything. He just told them what he knew, that being seen, being heard, mattered more than anyone realized. By the end of that first week, something began to shift. It started small. A junior developer who usually kept to herself stopped by his temporary desk to ask for advice about her father's illness. A team assistant quietly thanked him for something he'd said in a meeting. Then, a department head lingered after a strategy session, not to talk about profits, but about burnout and how empty his work had begun to feel. One by one, people began to seek him out, first the interns, then the executives. Not because James had answers, but because, for the first time in a long time, someone at Infinity Group was listening without expecting anything in return. He didn't come with spreadsheets or charts. He came with questions no one had thought to ask. When was the last time you really looked someone in the eye? Do you know the name of the janitor who cleans this floor? Would you stop to help if you saw someone crying in the break room? The walls that once kept everyone separate began to crack, slowly but surely. And something else began to change, too, something outside those glass walls. Because with Claire's quiet help, and a small housing stipend she insisted on slipping into his contract, James was finally able to do something he hadn't dared to dream of. He bought a house. It wasn't much. A modest one-bedroom at the edge of Brooklyn, with a sagging porch and a tiny patch of grass out front. But it had real walls that didn't rattle in the wind. It had a kitchen with warm light spilling out at night. It had a room he could call his own. More importantly, it had space for Noah. For months, James had written to his son, kept his distance while he tried to put the pieces of his life back together. Now, for the first time in years, he had something to offer. Noah moved back in with him the day he finished his first semester at a local university. He was taller now, his voice deeper, but when he stepped into that little house, dropped his duffel bag on the floor, and hugged his father tight, James felt something fall back into place inside him. Their first dinner was nothing special, spaghetti and garlic bread, eaten at the wobbly kitchen table while the radio played softly in the background. But for James, it might as well have been a banquet. That night, after they finished eating, Noah looked across the table, his eyes shining. "You kept your promise," he said quietly. James didn't answer, he couldn't. The lump in his throat was too big. But the look in his eyes said everything. And as the weeks passed, something else changed between James and Claire. At first, it was casual, a quick chat in the hallway, a coffee break after meetings, an occasional lunch where they talked about nothing and everything. But slowly, without either of them meaning to, those small moments became something more. They started walking to the subway together after work. Weekend coffees turned into dinners. Long conversations about their pasts, their fears, their hopes, filled the spaces between them. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't fast. It was something quiet, steady, like two people who had spent years building walls, finally finding someone who didn't want to climb them, but simply sit beside them. One evening, as they stood on the rooftop of the office building, watching the sun dip behind the skyline, Claire looked over at him. "You've changed this place, James." He shook his head, a small smile tugging at his lips. "No," he said. "I just reminded them of something they already knew." She turned to face him fully, her expression softening. "And you reminded me." The city stretched out before them, busy, loud, unfeeling. But up there, in the quiet glow of a setting sun, James finally felt like he belonged. A year passed. And on a crisp autumn morning, the lobby of Infinity Group looked nothing like it usually did. Gone were the sleek banners of quarterly profits, the posters of new product launches, the corporate chatter about deadlines and deals. Instead, soft white drapes hung from the ceilings. Strings of warm lights crisscrossed the atrium. A large sign stood front and center, written in elegant, simple letters. One Kindness Day. Employees gathered shoulder to shoulder, not in suits and power dresses, but in jeans, sweaters, and easy smiles. Some held their children by the hand. Some chatted quietly over coffee. But all of them were here for one reason. On the small stage at the front of the room, Claire Langston stepped up to the microphone. The crowd fell silent. Her voice, when she spoke, was softer than usual, but clear and steady. This day isn't about metrics, she began. It's not about growth charts or bottom lines. It's about moments. She glanced at the audience, her eyes landing briefly on James, standing near the back. A year ago, on a freezing night in this city, I was standing alone at a bus stop, cold, tired, and more lost than I even realized. And then, a man whom I had never met did something no one else did that night. He gave me his coat. A soft murmur rippled through the crowd. Many of them had heard the story. Most hadn't heard it like this. Claire smiled gently. It was old. Worn. But it was everything. Because it reminded me that real kindness doesn't wait until it's convenient. It shows up when the world least expects it. She turned to the easel beside her and pulled away the cloth covering it. Behind the glass was the very same olive green jacket. Frayed at the sleeves. Faded from years of use. Beneath it, engraved on a small bronze plaque, were the words, "One small act of kindness can rewrite a life." Claire's voice wavered slightly as she spoke again. That night didn't just change my evening. It changed my entire life. And today, we honor not just that moment, but the man who made it possible. She glanced toward the back of the room. "James," she said softly, "would you come up here?" The crowd turned as James slowly made his way forward. He wore a simple dark suit, one borrowed from a friend, but pressed with care. His hair was neatly combed. His steps were steady, sure. When he reached the stage, Claire smiled and reached into her pocket. "I have something for you," she said. She handed him a small envelope. James opened it carefully. Inside was an official document, the title deed to the small house in Brooklyn he and Noah had made their home. A few quiet gasps echoed through the crowd. Claire leaned in, her voice soft but certain. "No more sleeping in trucks." The room erupted in applause. But before the noise could settle, James cleared his throat and raised a hand. I have something too." The crowd fell quiet again. Slowly, James reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn velvet box. He turned to Claire, his heart pounding. "You said once that this coat changed your life," he said, voice thick with emotion. "But you changed mine. You gave me back my name, my son, a roof over my head. And something I never thought I'd have again." He opened the box. Inside was a simple silver ring, polished but understated, shining quietly under the lights. "I kept it in the pocket," James said, voice trembling. "Because if there's anything more valuable than that coat, it's you." Claire's breath caught in her throat, her eyes wide, glassy with unshed tears. "Claire Langston," he continued, taking a shaky breath, "will you marry me?" For a moment, the room held its breath. And then, Claire laughed, a soft, choked, beautiful sound, and nodded through her tears. "Yes," she whispered. "Of course, yes." The crowd erupted again, standing, cheering, clapping, but James didn't hear any of it. All he saw was her, the woman who had once shivered alone at a bus stop, now standing in front of him, her hands in his, her smile breaking open the last of the cold places inside him. A month later, they were married. But not in some grand ballroom or luxury hotel. They chose Thomas's place, the small, red brick community center that had meant so much to both of them. The chairs didn't match. The cake was made by one of the interns from James's mentorship program. The music came from an old speaker set on a folding table. But the room glowed. Children James had met through Claire's community work ran barefoot between the chairs, giggling. Volunteers from the shelters he'd once slept in brought flowers. Employees from Infinity Group, interns, janitors, developers, all the people he'd quietly touched over the last year, filled the room. Noah stood at James's side as best man, a quiet smile on his face. And when Claire took James's hands and looked into his eyes, her voice clear and sure, she said, "Once, on a cold night, you gave me your only coat. Tonight, I give you my whole life." The words fell over the crowd like sunlight breaking through clouds. James didn't speak, he couldn't. Not without his voice cracking. But he nodded, his eyes shining with quiet tears, the same way they had that night on the street when she first asked his name. Later that evening, as the reception spilled out into the courtyard under strings of fairy lights, someone snapped a photo, Claire and James standing beneath the painted sign of Thomas's place, her head resting on his shoulder, his arm around her, and beside them, on a simple easel, the old green jacket that had started it all. That image would travel further than either of them could imagine. It would be shared, reposted, talked about, not because they were rich or powerful, but because it reminded people everywhere that kindness doesn't require perfection. Just presence. Just heart. And sometimes, the smallest gesture, a jacket, a smile, a kind word, can echo farther than we ever imagine. James once thought he had nothing left to give. But he gave anyway. And in doing so, he didn't just change Claire's life. He changed his own. The day of their wedding wasn't grand or extravagant. There were no black tie invitations, no glittering chandeliers, no press photographers lurking outside. No headlines about a CEO marrying a man who used to sleep in his truck. Instead, it was something far more meaningful. They chose to get married at Thomas's place, the little red brick community center that had quietly been the beginning of everything. The place that had once been a shelter for a lost, shivering girl named Claire. The place where James had stood, not long ago, surrounded by laughter and chaos, and finally felt like he belonged. On that afternoon, the walls were strung with paper flowers, handmade by the very children who spent their days there. The mismatched chairs were filled not with billionaires or corporate giants, but with people who had walked through life's hardest seasons, volunteers who had stayed long after others left, shelter workers who had offered warm meals on cold nights, young employees whom James had mentored in his quiet, steady way. There were no designer place settings, no fancy dinner menu. The cake was baked by one of the interns from James's resilience workshops. The music came from a borrowed speaker and a playlist made by Claire's assistant. Children ran barefoot across the courtyard, chasing bubbles in the evening light. But the room glowed. Not with luxury. Not with wealth. It glowed with something money couldn't buy: kindness, community, and a love built not from fairy tales, but from real, messy, human moments. When Claire walked down the aisle, she didn't wear a designer gown. She wore a simple white dress, her hair falling in loose waves over her shoulders. There were no diamonds or pearls, just a single flower tucked behind her ear. James stood at the front, not in a tailored tuxedo, but in the same suit he'd worn the day he first stepped onto the stage at Infinity Group, cleaned, pressed, and worn with pride. Beside him stood Noah, tall and steady, smiling as he watched his father finally get the life he'd always deserved. And when Claire reached him, she took his hands in hers and smiled the way she had that night at the bus stop, like he was the only person in the world. Her voice was soft but clear as she spoke her vows. "Once, on a freezing night, you gave me your only coat," she said. "You didn't know who I was. You didn't ask for anything in return. But you gave me warmth when I needed it most. And that night, you gave me more than a jacket, you gave me a reason to believe in kindness again." She paused, her eyes shimmering. "Tonight, I give you everything I have. My heart. My life. My forever." James didn't speak, he couldn't. His throat tightened too much to form words. But the look in his eyes, the way he squeezed her hands, said everything. When they exchanged rings, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. And when they kissed, the crowd erupted, not with polite applause, but with genuine, heartfelt cheers. The kind that comes from people who know what it means to struggle and to hope. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the fairy lights above the courtyard flickered on, someone snapped a photo. In the picture, Claire and James stood beneath the sign of Thomas's place. She rested her head on his shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her. And beside them, propped gently against an easel, was the old olive green jacket, now framed, preserved, no longer frayed but forever meaningful. That photo would quietly spread online in the weeks that followed. Not because of who they were, but because of what their story represented. A reminder that sometimes, the smallest gesture, the simplest, quietest moment, can rewrite an entire life. James never set out to change anyone's world. On that cold night, he had nothing left. No job. No home. No clear path forward. But he gave what he could. A jacket. A moment. A piece of his heart. And in return, he didn't just change Claire's life, he changed his own. Their story is not about grand gestures or perfect fairy tale endings. It's about how the tiniest spark of kindness can ripple through the world in ways we never expect. And if you remember nothing else from this story, remember this. Sometimes, all it takes to change a life is one small moment, one kind gesture, one human heart. And maybe, as you listen to this story, you realized something too. That kindness isn't measured by how much we have, but by how much we choose to give, even when we think we have nothing left. James didn't have money, power, or status. All he had was a coat, a moment, and a heart big enough to offer both without expecting anything in return. And that simple act, on a cold, forgotten night, rewrote the course of 2 lives. So the next time you wonder if a small gesture matters, the next time you question whether a smile, a kind word, or an outstretched hand can make a difference, remember James. Remember Claire. And remember that sometimes, one simple act of kindness can ripple further than you'll ever know. Thank you for spending your time with me today and listening to this story. If it touched your heart, if it reminded you that there's still light and goodness in this world, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and leave me a comment below. I'd love to know what part of this story spoke to you the most. And if you want more stories like this, stories that warm your heart, restore your faith in humanity, and remind you of what truly matters, make sure to subscribe to Mr. Michael Stories and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next one. Until next time, my friend. Stay kind. Keep believing. And never underestimate the power of one small act.